Audacious Rebel. So welcome back to the path of the Audacious Rebel. I hope you have been enjoying these episodes and it does something to you, allows you to think and recognize some of the issues we're dealing with and how to get to the core and the root of it. You know, in January, when we began this podcast, the path of the Audacious Rebel, we opened the season with the question, what is crime? Now, we sought to identify if it is simply an act that violates written law, or is it something more layered, something that emerges from a complex web of intention, upbringing, culturing, trauma, perception, and one's socio-cultural environment. We questioned if it is a failure of morality or if it is a reflection of a society in distress. Is it the crack in the law book or the echo of a fracture in the soul of a human being? When I began this season, I wasn't just looking to talk about crime in the traditional sense. I wasn't looking to start a crime show and identify perpetrators and evidence like CSI or just highlight criminals or criminal theories. I was searching for what lies beneath it, trying to get to the roots, the energy, the forgotten stories, and the unspoken pain that it brings. I wasn't just interested in just naming problems. I wanted to see how crime and the system built to respond to it reflects back to us who we are as a people, who we are individually, and more importantly, who we are not. Over the course of this season, I sat down with people who have felt crime, who lived through it, who studied it, who responded to it, and who have forgiven from it. I spoke to people like Reverend Bill McDonald, Dr. Kazim Kimal Rahim, Dr. Jitmood, and Dr. Cheryl Holmes. I spoke to criminologists such as Craig Pinky out in the UK, former Lieutenant Charles Rambo in Atlanta. We spoke to activist and poet Mtima Solwazi, who's out in Trinidad and Tobago. We spoke to Dr. Victor Coleman and Rukai Abdul Mutakalim, not forgetting. We also spoke to the president of the Prisons Officers Association in Trinidad and Tobago, which is Mr. Gerard Gordon. And each guest brought a piece of a greater puzzle. Each guest shared truth wrapped in some personal experience or some scientific insight, some spiritual depth, and plain raw humanity. And now what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try to bring it all together. This does not mean to say that it's the end of the season, because there are some people that I still want to speak to. But based on all that was done so far, I wanted to capsulate in a sort of summary all that was done. And this episode is a journey. It is a reflection of all the voices that we have heard from, the voices that challenged me, some of the voices that moved me and redefined what I thought justice, transformation, and consciousness actually mean. So whether you're listening to every podcast or this is your first, welcome. Let's walk slowly through these insights together. One of the commonalities that was identified throughout the episodes was the impact of trauma. And this is something I want to speak on a bit. And we have seen the impact of trauma on various levels, individually, institutionally, and even societally, where even the notion of societal culture and its impact was discussed. Although it was not identified specifically in our discourse, there's a powerful idea in neuroscience known as neuroplasticity. And what neuroplasticity states basically is that what fires together wires together. We may have used that term differently, and I'm sure some of you may have heard the term before that which states that energy flows where attention goes. Where we focus develops aspects of ourselves. Energy flows where our attention goes, and which primarily reflects the same thing as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change and adapt throughout an individual's life. There are two types of neuroplasticity: development plasticity and adaptive plasticity. Development plasticity occurs naturally as one grows and matures, and adaptive plasticity refers to the capacity of the nervous system to reorganize its structure, its function, or connections in response to experiences, in response to learning, in response to one's environment, behavior, or even an injury. And this relates to the interrelationship between nature and nurture. And I'm sure a lot of us may have heard about that connection or that inter dependent relationship of nature and nurture, and how nurturing affects on nature, and how nature affects nurture, and each affects each other. And this effect, the effects of this can be either positive or negative. I want to give you a perfect example of neuroplasticity in child development. During the first few years of life, a child's brain is incredibly plastic, especially when it comes to learning language. Imagine a child being born in a bilingual household, for instance, and that child is hearing probably both Spanish and English from birth. Even though the brain isn't fully developed, it begins forming distinct neural pathways for both languages. And what will happen over time is that the child's brain becomes wired to understand and speak both languages fluently without having any formal instruction in any one of the languages. Now, contrast that with an adult learning a second language. And you would see how difficult it is for an adult. It's harder and it's slower. And what happens now, it requires greater effort. And that's because the adult brain has already solidified certain neural pathways. And while a child's brain is still forming and pruning connections based on what it is exposed to. Another positive example of this is like learning to play a musical instrument. What happens? It strengthens connections in the brain areas related to motor skills and auditory processing. So much so that it almost appears automatic over a period of time. You probably heard the statement such as, "He's so good on that keyboard, he can play it with his eyes closed." That is because neural pathways have been established in his brain. So it's almost an automatic thing. But it can also have adverse effects as well based on what one is constantly being exposed to. So imagine a child growing up in a home where the experience consistently is neglect, emotional neglect. There's no comfort when that child may be crying or in distress. There's little eye contact with the parents, no soothing, no touch, etc. And generally a basic emotional lack. This lack of nurturing care triggers a stress response in the child's brain, especially when it is done over and over and over. This is the child's environment. It's a toxic environment. And it does not have to be based on simply nurturing. It could be the natural environment of that child. the societal environment. After a period of time, because of this same neuroplasticity, the child brain adapts to this environment. It starts to wire itself for survival, not connection. It's about surviving, not thriving. And what does that look like in the child's brain? It may lead to an overactive amygdala, which is the brain's fear center. It may lead to underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for reasoning and emotional regulation. And when you have underdeveloped prefrontal cortex and you have a developed hindbrain, you're talking about an impulsive person, someone whose executive function is not how it should be. So this is someone who is just active impulsive. So, you might be at an event and someone get stepped on his feet by mistake, and immediately that person wants to fight. You see an overreaction with certain things. You've seen it in the schools. What we're seeing in the schools in terms of the school fights and whatnot with the younger children, does this have to do with development within the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex? Does this have to do with overactive amygdala? What we see when these things happen, we have poor connectivity between the emotional and logical brain regions. And now that child may grow into an adult who struggles with trusting others, who reacts strongly to stress or rejection, totally overreact. And that person would find it difficult and hard to regulate their emotions. And that means that the more the brain experiences a certain emotional state, such as fear and rejection or abandonment, the more those neural pathways become like the default setting for that individual. So, when you have experiences such as trauma, particularly in childhood, it wires the brain to survive, not to strive. And what we're seeing now, we're seeing a society that is in survival mode. You know, Walter Cannon, psychologist Walter Cannon, he coined the term the fight or flight syndrome. This term was developed further to include freeze. And this is a reflection of the body's autonomic response to stress, which is an automatic thing that is designed to protect the organism. Walter Cannon, that's a psychologist, you can look it up, and he spoke about the fight or flight syndrome. And as I said, we have since developed that to include freeze. Flight, fight, or freeze. These are the three actions that an organism, an individual, would take when faced with particular experiences or situations. A nice analogy I like to use is that of a deer. Let's say there's a deer, and he's out in the Serengeti. He's just relaxed and he's eating grass. And here comes a lion. That lion is hungry, and that deer is his target. When that deer sees that lion, there are three things that deer can do. The deer can freeze in fright. He could fight, or he can take flight. But definitely, that deer is not going to fight with the lion. And if he's going to take flight, there are certain things that immediately is going to happen with the deer's body. And it's a similar thing occurs with the human being. Immediately, the amygdala activates the brain's fear center, and it lights up like an alarm, sending a danger signal to the rest of the body. hormones are going to be released. A flood of hormones, adrenaline and cortisol is going to flood the system. These stress hormones surges through the bloodstream to increase energy and alertness. Immediately, the heart rate is going to increase and blood pressure is going to spike. The heart beats faster to send more oxygen to your muscles in preparation to run, to fly. Breathings become shallow and rapid because the lungs is working harder now. We got to fuel the body with oxygen, essential for a quick escape. Muscles tense up, especially in the legs. Your body is physically preparing to bolt. Digestion slows down or stops. Blood is diverted away from the non-essential functions. So all the blood from the visceral area that would have been responsible for digestion and otherwise is now being pushed to the appendages, to the arms, to the legs. In the case of the deer, to the legs, because that deer needs all the energy it can get to survive, to flight, to flee. Everything is directed towards survival. Tunnel vision, heightened senses. You become hyper focused on escape routes, and peripheral awareness and rational thought diminishes. These reactions to whatever threat may be, however, should be a temporary one. Because after that deer escapes from that lion, his body will automatically return to a state of what is known as homeostasis. It will go back to the regular functioning. It's not a permanent state. No organism can survive healthily in that state. But this is what is happening with us human beings. Because that deer is not going to talk about that story with his friend there the next day or the day after about what happened the day before with this lion. But we continually live in that state for years upon years and generations upon generations. Even in our adult years, we are still speaking and rehashing situations and experiences that brought us pain, that brought us trauma, and was never addressed. So, what we are actually doing, we have taken a temporary state and have made it permanent. Every single guest in this season brought up trauma in some form. Dr. Cheryl Holmes talked about the importance of parenting, how the absence of love, guidance, and affirmation molds a child's sense of self-worth and emotional intelligence. She echoed psychologist Bowlesby's attachment theory in psychology, which says that without secure loving bonds early in life, individuals often struggle to form healthy relationships. And this relational dysfunction or antisocial behavior can manifest in various ways, be it violence, addiction, or crime. And this is clear from what can be observed presently in schools. Let's be honest with ourselves. If we can reflect on some of our peers in elementary school or primary school, at that age, 7 years old, there were certain traits that could have been identified in specific individuals. I'm not saying that these individuals would have turned out to be criminals based on the will and decisions they would have made, but there would have been a particular inclination. This had to do with their culturing. This may have been done, has to do with how their brain was formed, deficiencies in their neocortex area, as the case may be. Craig Pinky, the criminologist in the UK, he explained the sociological side, the intersections of poverty, of systemic racism, lack of opportunity, and generational trauma. What he did, he gave us the street level truth that youth violence is not born from evil, but from exclusion. from a lack of identity, a, a sense of not feeling safe, and a sense of not belonging. And again, this reflects on a sort of abandonment, societal abandonment, exclusion. And although he reflected more on the sociological side, from what I just outlined, you can see how the sociological would and could affect the biological. Again, here we are seeing the interrelationship between nature and nurture. Dr. Victor Coleman showed us how trauma leads to choices, not because someone is morally broken, but because their environment offered no blueprint for something better. So you're seeing both a micro and a macro perspective. His story, grounded in both psychology and experience, and mirrors what psychologist James Garbarino called the lost boys phenomenon, where children, especially boys, are socialized in environments devoid of emotional fluency, of mentorship, or of spiritual grounding. Gerard Gordon, from Trinidad, the president of the Prisons Association, he brought the lens of institutional trauma. Not only the trauma that inmates bring into the system individually, but the trauma perpetuated by the system itself. As a leader in the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service, he stressed that correctional institutions often mirror societal dysfunction. That's where we spoke about culture, societal culture. He emphasized that rehabilitation must address psychological wounds and social reintegration, and that healing must occur within the walls and not just after release. And he challenged us to reimagine correctional spaces as transformative spaces where healing is prioritized over punishment and reintegration is supported by community. And one of the issues we spoke about where that was concerned is, let's say there is a efficient and effective rehabilitative program, and now these individuals, these inmates, have to return to society, reformed and rehabilitated. But the society that they are returning to was the said society that shaped and molded them. So, what are we actually doing? It's like taking a drug addict out of a drug infested environment, reforming, rehabilitating him, and then sending him back to live in the said environment. What do you think would be the result? One of the many contemporary experts whom I did mention on probably more than one episode is Professor Adrian Rain. I've read a lot of his work. I even invited him to my podcast, but he's extremely busy. If you want to know more about him, you can look him up on YouTube. You could buy his book. I'll mention his book. He is a pioneer, though, in the field of neurocriminology, and he's the author of various publications. And some of his books include The Anatomy of Violence, The Biological Roots of Crime, and The Psychology of Crime, Criminal Behavior as a Clinical Disorder. Both books can be found in my bookstore, which will be in the description via the link below. Now, what Rain was able to prove was that trauma doesn't just affect emotion, it reshapes the brain itself. And he documented how the amygdala, responsible for fear and internal detection, as identified before, becomes hyperactive in abused children, while the prefrontal cortex, which regulates decision making, can become underdeveloped. The result? Impulsivity, rage, disconnection from consequences. And we are seeing that. We are seeing a generation of people, individuals, who seem to not even be aware or concerned about the consequences of their actions. We are seeing children fighting in schools to the extent that arms, bones are broken, eyes are lost, among other things. There's a clear disconnection with the consequences. And I can speak of this as well, being both a former correctional officer and a law enforcement officer, where I worked with a lot of the criminal elements. And there were many instances, many times where you would recognize that what would be the average person, the thoughts of the average person. We would work out situations and experiences, and we would calculate and be logical in our thinking. In many of them, it was clearly absent. Now, this does not apply that automatically one would become a criminal. But if there is a propensity to be a particular way, impulsive, because an individual has an overactive amygdala or an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, then the probability of engaging in antisocial behavior is drastically increased. And if the probability of engaging in antisocial behavior is drastically increased, then automatically there's an increased propensity for criminal behavior. And Rain is but one of many experts who have done tremendous research in this sphere. There are others like Dr. Patricia A. Brennan, and she does a lot of work. I think she's attached to Emory University out here in Atlanta. And she have done a lot of work, a lot of focus being prenatal care, because a lot of these issues does not begin at birth, but even prior to birth, whilst in the womb of that mother. And if that mother who is pregnant is in a stressful environment, a toxic environment, again, there would be effect on the brain in terms of an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, because that child would be equipped to deal with a stressful environment. And not only Patricia Brennan, if you listen to the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Joe Dispenza, and many more. And a lot of these authors, their book, their work are available in my bookstore, and the link is at the bottom of this video in the description. And from this alone, we can recognize that there may be much more to criminal behavior than we previously imagined. Crime is not random. It is a response. It is a symptom. It is a signal. But more than a symptom, it creates a cycle. Because though it is a symptom, it is also a cause. Because crime yields even more crime. And we cannot begin to fix what we refuse to understand. And this was my first objective in establishing this podcast. We must get understanding. We must seek to have a comprehensive understanding of why things are the way they are, not just react to things on the surface. If you have any questions, comments, or can expand on how trauma and other early psychosocial experiences can affect us biologically or otherwise, please outline your questions or comments below so that we can explore this even further, because this is not done. There's much, much more to understand. Another variable that appeared to be very significant throughout this season was the power of forgiveness and healing. And in some way, I guess that this can be related to the first variable of trauma, as it appears that trauma itself perpetuates some form of brokenness, and which in many instances stem from the actions or inactions of another, whether it be an abusive father, an emotionally detached mother, the betrayal of a spouse, or being robbed by a criminal. What we have is a perpetrator and a victim. I'm sure that Many of us have heard the quote before that hurt people hurt people. Yeah, hurt people hurt people. Every single one of us have been hurt one way or the other, whether directly or indirectly. Until there is a stop to this, though, there would never be an end because it's a cycle of hurt, it's a cycle of pain, it's a cycle of brokenness, and which can go on from generation to generation. I remember as a child, my grandparents, our grandparents, didn't speak to us on either side, and we never understood why until as an adult. And when you recognize sometimes what the issues were, it was so trivial. But that has to do as well to their lack of understanding. We're seeing now a lot of race war and debates and conflict. And the essence and the basis of that, and this is something I've been saying every time I speak, the core of all of our issues stem from ignorance. But let's get back to hurt people hurt people. And how do we break this cycle? And the only way this cycle can be broken is when we decide to forgive and heal. I'm not talking about what we normally do on the surface by playing strong and sidestepping or suppressing our hurt and pain, because I know sometimes it can be very difficult to face. But when we suppress it and tend to sidestep it or ignore it, what we do, we actually make those issues even stronger. Because, looking at it from an energetic perspective, and we're going to do that when we reflect on what Dr. Kazim Kemal or Rahim brought to the table. But when we do so, when we sidestep or suppress it, it becomes stronger and it acts as triggers in our lives, even in our adult years and beyond. So this is not just the move on kind of forgiveness. What I'm talking about here is the deep, soul level, paradigm shifting forgiveness that turns grief into grace. And this is not impossible. We have had more than one example right here on this podcast. We have had real life examples of this. When we spoke to people like Rukai Abdul Mutakalim, who didn't just forgive the person who took her son's life, but she turned her pain into purpose. Her journey reflects what psychologist Dr. Richard Tedeschi, and Dr. Lawrence Calhoun call post-traumatic growth. According to Tedeschi and Calhoun, trauma, even though we have seen how trauma can have disastrous consequences, it can also lead to a greater sense of personal strength. It can also lead to a renewed spirituality, and we have seen this in so many people, and a deeper appreciation of life. If you know about the work of thinkers Byron Katie, if you ever read the work of what's his name? I'll remember. But trauma can also yield positive responses. But that is only when the trauma is processed and not suppressed. Eckhart Tolle, that's the name I was trying to recall. Eckhart Tolle. Because trauma can awaken growth. Trauma can awaken meaning and purpose. But that will only happen if we support healing properly. And Dr. Jitmood, he gave us a living example as his son was also murdered. Yet he looked the perpetrator in the eye inside a courtroom and extended forgiveness. As he personally outlined, that act was not an easy thing to do. In fact, Dr. Jitmood prayed that no one ever experiences anything like this, and prays that he never experiences it himself. The act he undertook, it didn't erase the pain. It was not something easy to do, but it reclaimed power. This act of forgiveness, it was a protest against vengeance, not from weakness, but from a place of radical spiritual strength. His actions immediately severed the cycle perpetuated by hurt people hurt people. And this was something I speak about not just on my podcast, but on so many different shorts and different clips that I speak about justice. When I show that when I look at justice contemporarily, what I'm seeing is a form of revenge. And this is how we see justice. Something was done to me and now it must be done to them. Retribution, one way or the other. And if I may not have the capacity to do it, I wish the state do it. Or I wish it is done to him by one of his peers. So my son was murdered, he should be facing the death penalty. Or one of his peers should kill him as well. And then I'm going to say that's only his karma. And I'm going to feel joy because of what was done. This is revenge, even though we would say revenge belongs to the Lord. We just try to find a nice way to clothe it. So we call it justice. I'm reminded of suggestions that Jared Gordon of the Prisons Association and Charles Rambo and even Reverend Bill McDonald, who all shared their perspective from working with inmates in correctional facilities. Bill McDonald, a Vietnam veteran and chaplain, he spoke about forgiveness in prisons. He described how transformation isn't sparked by punishment, but by compassion. When someone is seen, even in their darkest moments, they often begin to see themselves differently. Forgiveness is also aligned with spiritual law. In Islam, mercy is one of the highest attributes of the divine. In Christianity, Christ forgive them from the cross. In Buddhism, non-attachment liberates the soul from cycles of suffering, and in neuroscience, forgiveness lowers cortisol. It restores heart rate. It establishes homeostasis and rewires the brain for empathy and resilience. And this is something we spoke about before when I used the analogy of the deer. And could this be one of the reasons why we see so many people suffering now from so many different diseases, be it cancer, be it diabetes? Can all these ailments be byproducts of an internal environment that we are creating due to releasing certain toxics in our bodies? Too much adrenaline, too much cortisol, our internal culture. And I want you to pay note of that, take note of that, because as much as we have an internal culture that will affect our biological state, there's an external culture. Again, the microcosm and the macrocosm. And all this suggests that forgiveness is not passive. It's not simply letting someone off the hook. It's choosing to release the poison, to release that toxicity so that we ourselves does not become toxic. We ourselves does not become it. And in a world where punitive actions seem to be the default mode, it means that forgiveness is rebellion. Another factor, another variable that was spoken about throughout was mentorship and community. There's another variable. And what we're talking about here is building bridges. We have social media now, Facebook, and we have so many friends on Facebook, but really, are they really friends? Are we really connected? Like Dr. Holmes shared with me sometime, some of us have thousands of followers, but how many supporters do you really have? And as I sit here, I'm reminded of back in the day how we shared our connection, how the playfields were filled on weekends and after school, because this is how we connected. Now it's more individuality, and everyone's in their room, in front of a computer, in front of their phone. If trauma is the wound and forgiveness is the balm, then mentorship and community, that's the bridge. Gerald Gordon offered a crucial institutional perspective. As a leader of the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service, he emphasized the transformative power of correctional institutions, but only if society rethinks its approach. For Gordon, rehabilitation must replace retribution. He spoke about the psychological needs of offenders, the vital role of correctional officers, and the systemic reforms needed, including lessons we can learn from more. We learn lessons from more progressive international models, and he reflected on models like those in Canada. His insight echoed what many others shared, that change must involve not just individuals, but institutions surrounding them. And I go further, it must include the societal culture. One of these bridge builders we spoke to was Mtima Solwazi, the poet. And Mtima, he built that bridge. He built that bridge with poetry. He turned spoken word into a form of liberation, using rhythm and rhyme to awaken consciousness in young people who have been silenced by systems, who have been silenced by trauma. Charles Rambo, former lieutenant in Atlanta, he joined on from decades in law enforcement. He showed us the power of leadership grounded in integrity, not control. And he shared some personal experiences as well. His vision is clear. Mentorship must exist in institutions that shape lives, from the prison to the precinct. Dr. Victor Coleman's life was changed by one person believing in him, one mentor believing in him. And that belief birthed transformation. As psychologist Carl Rogers said, when someone receives unconditional positive regard, growth becomes inevitable. And I could share from my own personal experiences. I have had my dysfunction as well growing up in my family. And I can recall the first ever person that ever told me they believed in me. I was already a grown man. I was already a father. I was already a grown man and a father. I was already an adult, working, having a family. When I was told for the first time by Dr. Cindy Trim, I believe in you. Dr. Holmes emphasized mentorship in education, not as formal programs, but as embodied presence. Life readiness education, emotional resilience, financial literacy, creative thinking. This is the real curriculum. These are all factors that we have to look at where the educational system is concerned, and all the systems we need to look at that makes up a society. In sociology, this reflects Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social capital, the value of networks and relationships that help individuals navigate and succeed within society. And though I'm speaking about Pierre Bourdieu's and his social capital, there are so many forms of capital and even culture cultural capital. And if you understand or read the work of Lawrence Harrison, Culture Matters, and other books that he would have written, I think he would have transitioned now. But it identifies the importance of culture and how societal culture is one of the key or the main critical factor in development of a nation. So, but let's not stray. Let me not stray and go back on mentorship and that bridge, because mentorship is something is a variable that increases that capital. It opens doors that poverty and trauma have locked shut. You know, if we are to look at it from a spiritual perspective, mentorship is discipleship. And we cannot simply lay blame. We cannot simply castigate and condemn. It's about that passing on of wisdom, of energy and responsibility from one generation to the next. And this is something I find very easy for us to do. It's very easy to castigate. It's very easy to point fingers and lay blame. And what I recognize from my experiences working in the field, most of the people that point fingers and lay blame do so because they themselves do not have an answer. They themselves do not have a solution. And so they point fingers to take responsibility away from them. And this is what we have to recognize in this time and era, that we are all responsible one way or the next. We don't just need more experts, we need more leaders. And both Charles Rambo, Craig Pinky, and even Dr. Coleman outline something that was really critical, which was authenticity. Even in speaking with Dr. Holmes, Cheryl Holmes, we spoke about the educated criminal, because education, what we identify education to be in society today, does not deal particularly with inherent values. What we are seeing is not only a society being driven by survival, but being driven by ego. And once there is ego that is guiding this thing, then there is no authenticity. And we need mentors who are true and who are authentic. Another factor we spoke about was karma, consciousness, and universal laws. And I feel like this conversation wouldn't have been complete if we didn't step into some deeper waters, the metaphysical, the quantum, the spiritual side of things. I mean, we looked at crime from so many angles already: the sociological, the psychological, economic. And each of our guests brought something powerful. Reverend Bill McDonald gave us that soul perspective, that reminder that healing doesn't come from just locking people away, but from understanding the human behind the action. Craig Pinky showed us how the environment shapes behavior, especially for young black men caught in systems that never give them a chance to breathe. Dr. Chitmood, man, he cracked open our hearts, and who wasn't in tears when we saw that episode? We need to really look at ourselves. But he cracked open our hearts with what forgiveness really looks like. Dr. Chitmood and Rukai Abdul Mutakalim. But when Dr. Kazim Kimadul Rahim came on, he brought a shift. It was like the whole conversation shifted into a whole other frequency. He spoke about karma, about destiny, and life path analysis. Things that sounded mystical to some people, but are actually grounded in ancient systems of thought and increasingly validated by what we're learning in modern science today. In Vedantic philosophy, karma isn't about punishment. It's not this cosmic slap for doing wrong. It's simply cause and effect. But what you put out in the world, you get back. But even more than that, it's a pathway. It's how the soul develops. Sometimes we go through hardships, not because we did something wrong, but because our soul chose a tough curriculum. Now, there's a lot I could speak on where this is concerned, but I don't want to deviate too much. And probably in another season, when we get into the spiritual dimension of things and show how the spiritual is as scientific as what we know science to be, we'll dive into some of these areas even more. But I know that some of these things that I'm speaking here, that Dr. Kazim Urahim sound wild to some people. Why would a soul choose suffering? But when you think about it, it is pressure that creates diamonds. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens in fire. It was something a friend of mine, grandmother, used to always say. She used to say, if the mountain was smooth, you would not be able to climb it. If the mountain was smooth, you would be unable to climb it. And this is what discomfort does. It allows for growth. It happens in fire. Growth happens in fire. Sometimes it is the hardship we went through. It is the challenges we faced, the suffering we endured, which allowed us to grow, to now understand others better, to act in grace and humility, to know what empathy really is, to know the endless possibilities that exist in spite of what our reality may present. And that also lines up with something that Dr. Victor Coleman spoke about, how trauma isn't just something that happens to us, but something we can transform through. And reflecting again on neuroplasticity, it teaches us the same thing. The brain can change, and even though you may have been through certain traumatic things in your formative years or even prenatal, it is not a determinant. It can be rectified because it can be rewired in the brain. It can be rewired. Just because we had certain experiences or made certain choices doesn't mean we're locked into that identity forever. It doesn't mean that this is our destiny. It can be altered. And I believe the same is true for the soul. We're not fixed. We're fluid. We evolve. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Quantum physics. And I know that might sound like a leap, but stay here with me. When you understand the double slit experiment, and this experiment, if you go on YouTube, you just type Dr. Quantum double slit experiment, and you'll get a really nice breakdown of the double slit experiment. But what the double slit experiment shows is that the observer affects the outcome. But our mere presence affects our reality. Just by watching, you're influencing the result. Now think about that. That means consciousness isn't just floating in our head somewhere. It actually shapes reality. So when people say thoughts become things, it's not just motivational speak and talk here. It is a quantum truth. What we expect, what we believe, what we carry energetically is creating ripples in the field around us. And forget the name of the psychologist, the theorist that spoke about this field that we exist in that he called the matrix. And I'm not talking about the matrix that we know about with the movie. Forget the name of the theorist. I'll remember it. I'll remember him. But he spoke about this field that we exist in. And when you look at the double slit experiment, you'll understand how our mere presence affects the environment. And this taps into Carl Jung and when he talk about the collective consciousness. And that's why intention matters so much. And when we talk about crime, maybe the deeper question isn't just who did it or what law was broken. Maybe it's what energy is this a symptom of? What is the real core of this? These are the questions that as a society we need to start to ask. What if crime is the result of our collective disconnection? What is crime? What if crime is the result of our repressed societal pain, of unresolved trauma in the collective psyche? You heard Mtima Salwazi say it. We are living in a society that has normalized dysfunction, that has normalized greed, that has normalized hyper-individualism. We live in a society that is suffering from what I may call spiritual amnesia. And all of that creates the condition for chaos. Crime might just be the shadow of a society that has lost its center. You know, there's so much more I could expound upon. I've already been speaking for an hour, and this is not yet the completion of the season. There's a few more persons I want to speak to. You know, one of the things I recognized, one of the elements that popped up throughout is the role of the male. And when I say the male, there's a difference between a male and a man, and the role and function of a man. And when we look at the statistics, we would see the percentages as it pertains to males being involved in crime, being perpetrators. But not only that, their absenteeism in their roles as fathers, as husbands, as providers, and how indirectly this contributes to the sad issue of crime. So we're going to have some speakers to follow that will dive into this issue. So this is not the end of the season, but this might best be the perfect time that if you have not subscribed, to subscribe, to click that notification bell, because there's so much more to come. I'll end here, and I'll tell you to continue to be awesome, continue to be dynamic, and to continue to stay curious and audacious on that path of the Audacious Rebel. Audacious Rebel. Audacious Rebel.